He thought he had it all planned. A quiet neighborhood, a woman nobody would miss, and a group of men he trusted to do the job without questions. He was about to make the biggest miscalculation of his life, because the woman he was about to have beaten senseless had a father. Not just any father. Her father worked behind a desk in one of the most powerful buildings in America, and he would spend the next 3 decades making sure this man paid for every single second of her suffering. This is the story of a marriage that became a crime scene, a conspiracy that unraveled before it even began, and a family's dark secret that brought down an empire. And by the end of this video, you won't believe who saw it coming. 3 simple questions. First, how does a man convince hired killers to attack his own wife? Second, what made him so confident that he would never get caught? And third, the one that changes everything, who was waiting in the shadows the entire time. This isn't a case that made headlines because of what happened. It made headlines because of who was watching. And by the time the authorities moved in, it was already too late to stop the truth from coming out. So let's go back to where it all began. Back to a time when marriages were different, when trust was dangerous, and when nobody had any idea what was really happening behind closed doors. In the 1960s, love looked different than it does today. Marriages were promises whispered in churches. Trust was given before it was earned. And women often had no idea who they were truly marrying until it was far too late to leave. Our story begins with a woman we'll call Sarah. She was college-educated, intelligent, beautiful, and had options. Real options. She came from a well-respected family. Her father had built a career in federal law enforcement. Her mother came from old money. By all accounts, Sarah had everything a woman in the 1960s could want. But she chose him. His name was David. And David came from nothing. He was charming when he needed to be, violent when he wanted to be. He had a dream that consumed him. Wealth. Not just comfort. Not just success. Wealth. Real wealth. Power. Control. The kind of money that would make him untouchable. The kind of status that would make people fear him. Sarah didn't know all this when she married him. Nobody does. But her father, her FBI director father, had already been watching, waiting, knowing that eventually, his daughter's husband would make a move he couldn't take back. 5 years into the marriage, things had changed. David's business ventures had failed. One by one, they collapsed. His connections had dried up. The men he thought were his friends stopped taking his calls. And Sarah had started asking questions about where he went at night. About the men who called the house at odd hours. About why he never seemed to have real money despite all his talk about big deals and connections. She was asking the right questions. The kind of questions that make men like David nervous. This is where the story takes a turn. Because David made a decision that would echo through the next 3 decades of his life. He decided that Sarah was a liability. Not because she knew anything. She didn't. But because she was asking the right questions. And in David's world, questions were dangerous. They were the kind of thing that could lead to conversation. Conversation that could lead to suspicion. Suspicion that could lead to her talking to people she shouldn't talk to. So David did what desperate men do. He picked up the phone one evening, and he called a man he knew. A man who worked in the organized crime circles of the Northeast. A man who understood how problems got solved when they needed to be solved quietly. And he made a proposal that seems almost impossible to say out loud. He offered money, not a lot, but what he could spare, to have his wife beaten, not killed. He wasn't trying to murder her. He just wanted her hurt. Badly enough that she would be hospitalized. Badly enough that when she got out, she would be too traumatized to ask questions anymore. Badly enough that she would be too afraid of him to ever leave. What David didn't understand was that organized crime networks talk. They have histories. They have loyalties. And those loyalties run deeper than the money of a small-time operator who was barely holding on to his criminal credibility. The plan itself was simple in its brutality. 2 men would be sent to their home. Late night. Sarah would be alone. David had made sure of that by telling her he had a business dinner downtown. He wouldn't be back until after midnight. The men would enter through the side door that David had left unlocked. They would do their job. They would leave. David would find her later. He would call an ambulance. He would be the concerned husband, desperate for answers about who would do such a terrible thing. The police would have no suspects. Just a random assault. A crime of opportunity. A tragedy. The plan was perfect. Except for one detail. One detail that David had completely forgotten to account for. Someone in that organized crime network knew exactly who Sarah's father was. Someone had done their homework before they even agreed to take the job. Someone understood that this wasn't just a domestic dispute. This was a man trying to hurt the daughter of an FBI director. And that kind of information is currency in those circles. That kind of information gets shared. That kind of information gets reported up the chain to people who care about such things. The night the assault was supposed to happen, Two men showed up at the right address at the right time. But when the door opened, nobody was surprised. Because Sarah wasn't home alone. And the two men weren't walking into a defenseless situation. They were walking into something far worse. They were walking into a federal operation. What David didn't know was that federal agents had been monitoring the organized crime network for months. What he didn't know was that someone within that network had reported his phone call up the chain. What he didn't know was that Sarah's father had personally arranged for protection at the house that night. What he didn't know was that the moment those two men stepped across the threshold, they were walking into federal custody. The investigation that followed was swift and surgical. The two men arrested that night didn't stay silent for long. They had no reason to protect David. He wasn't connected enough to matter. He wasn't important enough to take a fall for. He was just a guy with a desperate idea and enough money to make a phone call. So they talked. They gave up everything. They told investigators about the phone call. They described David's voice. They explained his motive. They detailed the payment arrangement. All of it. Within 14 days, David was arrested at his office. He was charged with conspiracy to commit aggravated assault. The charges were serious. The evidence was airtight. But here's where the case becomes more complicated. Yes, David was arrested. Yes, he was charged. Yes, the media picked it up as a local crime story. Another wealthy businessman with a dark secret. Another marriage gone wrong. Another domestic violence case. But what the media didn't know was the real story happening behind the scenes. Sarah's father was making decisions about how to handle this. Because this wasn't just about justice. This was about his daughter. This was about protecting his family's reputation. This was about making sure that David understood exactly what it meant to have tried to destroy his child. And for the first time in the investigation, David realized his mistake. It wasn't that he tried to have his wife beaten. Criminals have orchestrated far worse and walked away. His mistake was that he had no idea who his wife's family really was. And by the time he understood it, the entire federal government was personally invested in his punishment. The trial lasted 6 weeks. David's lawyers argued that he had been entrapped by the organized crime network, that he was a weak man who made a stupid decision under financial pressure, that he had never actually intended to go through with it. It was all talk, all desperation, no real intent. They presented character witnesses, former business associates who said David was a good man, people who had known him for years. They showed his business losses in detail, bank statements, failed ventures, evidence of his financial desperation. They painted him as a victim of circumstance, a man pushed to the edge by forces beyond his control. The prosecution's case was different. They didn't need to paint pictures or tell stories. They had evidence. They had the phone call, not a recording, but testimony from the two men who had been arrested. Detailed testimony about what David had said, the exact words he used, the specific amount of money he offered, the timeline, the planning, everything. And then they did something that changed the entire trial. They presented something that made David's defense strategy collapse. They had the actual voice recording of David making the phone call to organize the assault. It had been captured by federal wiretaps on the organized crime network's communications line. His own voice, his own words, his own plan laid out for 12 jurors to hear. There was no coming back from that. No defense strategy in the world could overcome hearing David's voice on that tape. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Guilty on all counts. When the verdict was read, David didn't react. He simply sat there, understanding finally that his life as he knew it was over. He received a sentence of 15 years in federal prison. A sentence that would have been remarkable except for one thing. When the judge read the sentence, he made an unusual statement from the bench. He acknowledged the severity of the crime. He spoke about the violence inherent in what David had attempted. But he also acknowledged something else. He acknowledged that this case was unusual. That David had attempted to harm a woman whose family had connections to federal law enforcement. That the fact he had been caught so quickly and so completely was no accident. That Sarah's father had used every resource at his disposal to ensure justice was served. And the judge made it clear that David had not just broken the law. He had made an enemy of one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in America. But the trial wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of something darker. Because while David was in prison, something remarkable happened behind the scenes. Federal investigators began looking deeper into the organized crime network that had approached him. That phone call to arrange the assault? It wasn't a random connection. It was part of a larger criminal enterprise. One that had been operating for decades. One that Sarah's father had been quietly investigating the entire time. Using information gathered from David's trial. Using the testimony of the two men who had been arrested. Using the connections they had to the broader network. Federal investigators began building cases against other members of that organization. Over the next 5 years, that single case, The case that started with David trying to harm his wife became the foundation for federal investigations that dismantled 3 separate organized crime syndicates, 17 arrests across 3 states, hundreds of millions in seized assets, major players in the Northeast's organized crime world going to prison for decades. And at the center of it all was David's single phone call, his stupidity, his desperation, his decision to solve a personal problem by reaching out to criminals. David never knew that his crime had become a domino that toppled an entire criminal empire. He never knew that his wife's father had used him, intentionally, as a way to get into circles that had been impossible to penetrate before. He never knew that, in a strange way, his worst decision had ultimately served a greater good. He was serving his sentence in a federal penitentiary in Pennsylvania, completely unaware that his crime was the key that had unlocked a much larger investigation. Completely unaware that his wife's father was using everything he had learned from David's case to take down the network that had almost hurt Sarah. But here's the thing that haunts this story. Sarah's father never told his daughter what he had done. He never explained that he had essentially used her assault, her nearly assault, as cover to dismantle criminal networks. He never told her that federal agents had been monitoring her home, that they knew David was planning to hurt her before it could happen, that he had allowed the situation to develop because it gave him access to something bigger. Sarah found out the truth years later, and when she did, she struggled with it. Her father had protected her. Yes, he had made sure she was safe. He had arranged for federal protection that night. But he had also exposed her to danger, however calculated, for the sake of a larger investigation. She had been safer than she knew, but she had also been used. Not by her husband, by her father. That realization changed something between them. Not permanently, not in a way that destroyed their relationship, but it added a layer of complexity that had never been there before. Because how do you forgive your parent for using you as bait? How do you reconcile the fact that the person who loved you most was also willing to let you experience danger because of a larger strategic objective? David spent 30 years in and out of the prison system after his initial release. He died in 2008, alone, in a small apartment in the Midwest. Nobody attended his funeral. Nobody mourned. Sarah eventually settled into a quiet life. She divorced David while he was in prison. She remarried someone kind, someone ordinary, someone who had no connections to crime or federal law enforcement. She had children. She built something good out of the wreckage of that first marriage. And her father? He retired from the FBI with honors. Full pension, awards for dismantling organized crime networks, commendations from the Department of Justice, a career marked by success and service. He never publicly acknowledged what his daughter went through. He never spoke about how he had used her near assault as the doorway to a larger investigation. It remained a family secret, protected by federal classification orders and the weight of what justice sometimes costs when it's real. The question this case leaves us with isn't about whether David deserved what he got. He did. He deserved every year of his sentence. He deserved the isolation. He deserved the way his name followed him through the rest of his life. The question is something much larger. How many lives have been sacrificed, knowingly or unknowingly, on the altar of larger investigations? How many times have federal agencies made calculated decisions to let crimes happen because it served a bigger purpose? How many people have been used as unwitting tools in pursuit of something they didn't even know was happening? And when justice is served through those methods, when it's achieved through calculated exposure and strategic sacrifice, is it really justice? Or is it just power dressed up in a suit and a badge? Is it protection? Or is it exploitation wrapped in the language of safety? These questions don't have easy answers. Because the truth is, David's case worked exactly as intended. The organized crime networks fell. Sarah's family was protected. Justice was served. And a larger good was accomplished. But the cost of that good was borne by a woman who had no choice in whether she would bear it. Who wasn't told what was happening. Who wasn't given the option to consent to the risk. And that's what haunts this story more than anything else. Not that David was caught and punished, but that the entire justice system that caught and punished him operated in the shadows, made decisions that affected people's lives without their knowledge, and called it protection. This case files away in archives now. Declassified documents tell parts of the story. Court records tell other parts. News articles capture fragments. But the full truth, the real depth of what happened and why it happened, died with Sarah's father. And maybe that's appropriate. Maybe some stories aren't meant to be fully understood. Maybe they're meant to haunt us, to make us question the systems we trust, to wonder what's happening right now in federal buildings across America. What decisions are being made in the shadows that will only make sense decades from now? What lives are being affected by strategies that nobody will ever explain to them? So I want to know what you think. Put yourself in Sarah's shoes for a moment. If you discovered that your parent, someone you trusted to protect you, had calculated your near assault as part of a larger strategy, how would you feel? Would you see it as betrayal? As pragmatism? As love taken to its darkest extreme? Would you forgive them? Or would you spend the rest of your life wondering what other secrets they kept in the name of protecting you? Comment below and tell me your thoughts, because I genuinely want to know how you would navigate that impossible choice. And if this story unsettled you, if it made you question the price of justice in this country, if it made you wonder about the institutional power that operates without oversight, make sure you're subscribed. Because there are stories like this hidden everywhere. Cases that should have been famous, families that should have been heard, and people whose suffering was the price of something bigger. We uncover those stories here because someone needs to tell them. Someone needs to shine a light on the places where justice and morality don't quite line up. Someone needs to ask the questions that make institutions uncomfortable. If you found this story compelling, if it made you think about justice and power and the cost of safety, like this video, your engagement helps these stories reach the people who need to hear them. And if you want to see what happened to the organized crime networks that David's case helped bring down, I've made a full deep dive video on that. It's in the cards above. Check it out. Because there's no conclusion to this story. There's only the next layer of truth waiting to be uncovered, and the next investigation waiting to happen, and the next person waiting to find out what really happened while they were busy thinking they were just living their life.